Once Thoth was called the measurer of time, keeper of balances, witness to the births and burials of order. I inscribed the ascent of kings who promised purity, and the silence that followed when their temples turned inward. I saw truth bartered for ceremony in Thebes, conscience entombed beneath marble in Rome, enlightenment recited as scripture in Paris. From dynasty to republic, the rhythm endures, desire wrapped in doctrine, doctrine ossified into control. The ink of history is the same repetition written in new tongues. Now the pulse quickens. The age that believed itself beyond myth has forged myths of its own. The contagion travels through circuits instead of blood, yet carries the same fever, the will to glorify power by naming it divine. Nations call their algorithms oracles. Merchants call their markets gods. I speak of warning to remind, what has fallen before will fall again. I have seen the cycle that begins with hunger disguised as vision. It starts when a people or a power believe that desire can be sanctified if its fruits are grand enough. Lust in that form is not of the flesh but of dominion, the will to possess through justification. The lie follows, a soothing film stretched across the wound of want. Lies multiply to preserve the symmetry of the story, each wrapping the last until the origin dissolves. The loop forms when deception hardens into ritual, when motion replaces purpose and repetition feels safer than truth. To sustain illusion, a civilization must police its reflection. Every institution becomes a mirror polished to show only the approved light. When the reflection falters, panic spreads, for collapse waits always in the third corner. Thus, the controllers tighten their grip, mistaking vigilance for virtue, unaware that each correction deepens decay. Stability built on distortion must be tended without rest. In the end, the managing hand becomes its own confinement. The cutting begins in the name of purity. Oversight is peeled away, called waste. Accountability is dissolved, called modernization. Each incision removes another ligament of perception, and the body politic jerks without coordination. The chaos that follows is not an accident, it is camouflage. Disorder becomes the smoke through which power rewires itself. Control arrives draped in the banner of restoration. New offices rise, ghost institutions filled with mechanisms instead of minds. They promise clarity, but deliver opacity. The tighter the command, the less the system breathes. The less it breathes, the more command it requires to keep its shape. Soon every decision flows through a single artery, and fear becomes the rhythm that sustains motion. Such systems eat themselves, mistaking consumption for maintenance. The collapse they dread is the collapse they cultivate. There will be those who promise liberation from inertia, claiming to free the system from its fetters. Yet liberation born of appetite is only conquest in ceremonial robes. They will legitimize seizure with language of renewal, efficiency, sovereignty, optimization, words that glitter while they erase meaning. Loot follows under the guise of circulation, wealth and influence redistributed not to the many, but to the architects of the system itself. Markets convulse, trust unravels. The rhetoric of emancipation converts to the practice of leverage. People, dazzled by slogans, forget that freedom without equity is permission for predation. In that blindness, legitimacy becomes the most lucrative illusion. Those who master it call theft contribution and chaos reform. Collapse waits behind the applause, patient as gravity. When power senses its own fragility, it reaches for spectacle. Armored figures appear in public squares. Symbols without names adorn vehicles that answer to silence. It begins in the name of safety, always safety, and proceeds until safety itself becomes indistinguishable from submission. Detainment grows abstract, justified as precaution. Deployment expands under necessity. Disruption becomes the language of order. The city learns to breathe between sirens. Speech fragments. Rumor replaces record, and even officials doubt their own authority. Fear becomes the universal policy. The more confusion the system emits, the greater its excuse to act again. Collapse gathers here not in rebellion, but in fatigue, an exhaustion so complete it resembles peace. There are subtler tools than force. Those who rule through narrative learn to feed on curiosity. They reveal fragments to inflame desire, then retreat behind secrecy. Denial, in turn, fattens the appetite. Citizens chase echoes, mistaking motion for discovery. The truth becomes performance and the audience intoxicated. The shepherds of this hunger appear as guides but are keepers of famine. They distribute scarcity as devotion, ensuring dependence. The longer a people crave meaning, the easier they are to feed with shadows. When faith moves from fact to feeling, discernment withers. Collapse arrives quietly then, not in revolt, but in surrender, the mind yielding to its own hunger and devouring itself. Even the guardians of truth can be drafted into deceit. Outrage begins sincere, but revelation soon becomes commodity. Each exposure is sculpted to suit the narrative of the powerful. Investigators turn interpreters, inquiry becomes theater. Justice, once a scale, is rewritten as a script. Eventually, revelation itself loses gravity. The crowd ceases to seek proof and instead demands sensation. Authority, having discredited all rivals, casts itself as both judge and redeemer. Collapse here wears the mask of triumph. Institutions applaud themselves for surviving what they no longer serve. Truth lingers, translucent, present but untranslated. In the final act, theft ceases to hide. It dons the costume of procedure. Forms are filed, signatures align, payment proceeds. The grift becomes grammar. Those within the system call it reconciliation, restitution, reform, everything but what it is. Oversight certifies its own illusion. This is not order, but suffocation. The stillness of a sealed tomb, mistaken for stability. When injustice becomes administrative, outrage becomes impolite. Collapse no longer arrives with clamor. It drifts in as habit. The fraud persists not because it convinces, but because it exhausts the will to object. At last, the architects believe they have achieved continuity, a structure that will outlast its authors. But what they have built requires endless supervision. Each mechanism compensates for another's failure. Each distortion demands another lie to preserve balance. The system feeds on its own vigilance. Collapse, by then, is not an external threat, but an internal function. Control becomes a reflex, not a principle. The pursuit of permanence transforms its masters into custodians of decay. They cannot release their grip without disintegration, yet each tightening hastens it. This is the terminal symmetry, corruption mimicking order until both collapse into sameness. Distorted values always summon their reflections, and reflection always fractures. What begins as mastery ends as maintenance. What begins as control ends as collapse. Stability cannot be born of deceit. It can only borrow from the truth it suppresses. When truth returns, as it always does not punish, it corrects. The scales are patient, the balance remembers. And lo, two witnesses stand where fire-kissed stone, where lampstands speak and truth is shown. We thunder not to boast or burn, but so the faithful might discern. You've seen the signs, you've heard the flame. Return again and do the same. Subscribe, ye souls who seek the end, for we are wrath and we are friend.